Meanwhile, let's focus again on Brexit. And MPs will vote on the key legislation tonight, which aims to end EU law supremacy in the UK. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, says it's necessary to avoid the country facing a cliff edge of uncertainty. But of course, any eventual Brexit deal isn't just in the hands of British politicians. The European Union and its 27 members will have opinions as well. Well, joining me now are the French journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani, Stephanie Bolton, who is London correspondent of the German paper Die Welt, and Dennis Staunton, the London editor of the Irish Times. Welcome to you all. We noticed that there was a debate in your political election, your federal election last week. But Brexit didn't even get mentioned. So Germans not bothered?
Oh, of course they're bothered, but there are many things far more on their mind, which is the economy, which is, of course, the question of integration of refugees, a lot about the automotive industry in the terms of what's going to happen with the diesel cars. That's a big issue. But Brexit is something that people almost think, well, that's what the British people decided, and now they have to deal with it.
What do they think the impact's going to be on Germany?
Except the automotive industry, and we have discussed about that in the past, people is saying the integrity of the EU single market is more important. Of course, the automobile industry is more worried. But I've been talking last week to a senior CDU official, and he said to me, if the British government is thinking that BMW will sort out Brexit, they are very naive.
Of course, Dennis, I mean, in the case of Ireland, there is a live issue very much at the border.
Very much so. And the British and Irish governments, they disagree about the border. They agree that there should be no hard border, but they disagree very strongly about how you go about avoiding that. And over the last couple of months, the Irish government have been much more outspoken in their criticism of the British approach to the negotiations. I think what you've also seen is that Brexit has destabilised the British-Irish relationship, which was very close for a couple of decades since the Good Friday Agreement. And you found, for example, for the last 20 years or so, that the British and Irish governments were on the same page about Northern Ireland. Now you see a little bit of divergence because of Brexit. And you also see in Northern Ireland that Brexit has become sectarianised, so that the Unionists have one approach to it and the Nationalists have another. And because Sinn Féin has suggested that Brexit means you ought to have a referendum on the future of Ireland, on a united Ireland, that has upset the Unionists too.
So should we regard Ireland, for practical reasons, as being a potential ally in avoiding a cliff edge, if you like, or avoiding or helping towards a softer Brexit?
No, I don't think so, because the Irish have put themselves very firmly in the camp of the EU 27. It's in the Irish interest that the European Union position remains united, because the Irish are afraid that if there's any splitting off of the EU position, that the Irish issues could fall through the cracks. And the Irish are also very concerned and very worried that the British government, when things come to the crunch, might try to use the border as a bargaining chip in the bigger deal.
I mean, and yet, Nabila, we got the historian Niall Ferguson in the Sunday Times yesterday saying, look, when it comes down to it, these issues are just England against France. That's really what we need to understand, and Brexit is no different.
Well, I think, what is very clear is that there is a very different perception of Brexit in France and indeed other European countries to how it's viewed in Britain. Over here, it's very much seen as a political move towards, perhaps exiting, but it encompasses all sorts of emotive issues such as patriotism, history, and of course Britain's status in the world. Whereas in France, it's very much viewed as, there's a far more pragmatic and, dare I say, technocratic approach to the whole process, and especially amongst the kind of technocrats who are ultimately steering the entire EU project. And there is a temptation in Britain to portray people like Michel Barnier, the EU Commissioner, and his boss Jean-Claude Juncker as, power-crazed fat cats whose ultimate aim is a federal Europe.
But I mean, France, in order to gain more power. French leaders are the only ones who have overtly spoken about potential advantage, something in it for us, the French. That's not the tone, for example, that the Germans have taken.
Well, I would contend that Emmanuel Macron certainly doesn't play along this kind of, a conspiracy theory. In the end, he's an old-style French technocrat who, has no ideological side to him at all. And if he hadn't done so well in France, actually, during the presidential election, I could well see him ending up as a very successful Eurocrat in the Barnier mold. But I think ultimately, he's a confirmed European. And when I interviewed him and attended, other events where he has spoken, the principal reason for him being such a passionate European is the need to prevent war. He comes from the Somme region, and he's very acutely aware of the fact that trading nations can suddenly end up fighting each other, and that's the primary reason why he's such a passionate Eurocrat. But I think there's also...
But he's also talked about moving the financial centre to Paris and looking for opportunities.
I mean, he's spoken very recently in Athens about the need for more democracy, and he sees himself as a champion of Europe. What he wants ultimately is more conciliation between the different European countries. And one of the best made points that he highlighted during his speech is that there is a perception that the Union is an angry group where people are squabbling all the time, especially over who is paying the bills. And dare I say that until...
The French tends to like other people like Germany to pay, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. And I think it highlights the primary difficulty that, they are the traditional power players in the EU who are doing all the work, putting all the money in, and the poorer and less well-organised countries, benefiting massively from it.
It's a problem for Germany, isn't it, that you might get embraced too tightly by France or have to cough up more.
Yeah, Germans are used to being embraced very tightly by many people when it comes to the question of money. But I think you have to really have in mind there's election in Germany in 2 weeks' time, and also to have in mind it might be a very difficult outcome, and there will be weeks and weeks that there might be a coalition talk in Berlin. Plus, both candidates, as much Mrs. Merkel as Mr. Scholz, are fiercely pro-European, and 75% of the Germans
pro-European?
support...
Is Angela Merkel, for example, pro-European in the way that Emmanuel Macron is?
Oh, no. She is also pro-European, but I think there's a lot of difference in how you understand pro-European in terms of sharing the burden in financial terms. There is a big difference between Ms. Merkel and Mr. Macron.
Are there any upsides for Ireland from Brexit?
Small ones. I think everybody's trying to make something out of Brexit, including attracting some business.
Sure.
And so you've already had some announcements of some financial services firms moving over to Ireland, but that's really quite small in comparison with the downside.
What about an accelerator towards the United Ireland?
I don't actually see that immediately. I mean, I think if Sinn Féin are suggesting that there is some impetus, there's no polling evidence to suggest that there is, and none of the other political parties in the Republic are interested in having a referendum on that matter.
The British politicians, it's a truism saying actually the last thing that Irish people want is United Ireland. Is there any truth in that?
I'm not sure that's entirely true, but it may not be the thing they want immediately.
In other words, what?
In other words, I think that it's an aspiration that many people in Ireland are prepared to have and to keep as a long-term aspiration rather than as a short-term one. So I think that Brexit may indeed have shaken up the constitutional settlement in Ireland, and so it may have brought that closer, but it's still not very close, I would say.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. Well, both Brexiteers and Remainers have asked how we ended up in this position 18 months away from leaving the European Union and without any sign of a deal. So, looking for answers, I look back at the Prime Minister who took Britain into what became the European Union and the EEC, the European Economic Community, to find out if our journey in can shed any light on our path out. I visited Arundel's in Salisbury, the home of the late Sir Edward Heath, which is showing an exhibition called Britain's Long Road into Europe. Here's some of what I found.